Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Dairy Signal this Thursday afternoon. I know, at least in my neck of the woods, it is sweltering hot out. So I hope you're either beating the heat or getting out of it for a little bit here this afternoon and is enjoying this episode of the Dairy Signal. But before we dive into today's topic, talking about what the fields look like, what our feed inventory options are, what does that even look like for the rest of the year even, let's talk a little bit about today in history. So we are jumping back to 1921 when scientists successfully isolated insulin. And for those of you who are maybe diabetic or more familiar with the history of diabetes, it is one that wasn't really friendly back in the day, as they knew it was its own condition for about 3,000 years, but scientists were unable to identify the cause of it or how to help cure it. And so those who were diagnosed with diabetes back in the day, in the early 1900s especially, they knew that they could about extend a person's life for about a year after that diagnosis. But it wasn't until 1921 when scientists successfully isolated insulin for the first time. And during this time, what happened is they were doing a couple tests in canines, and they were actually able to produce diabetic symptoms by successfully taking away some of the insulin in the pancreas in dogs, but then providing it back to them in order to see if it would successfully help them recover from that issue. And it was successful. And that is when that scientist really quickly turned around and figured out, okay, we can get a rather pure form of insulin from cattle that were going through the slaughterhouses. And they were able to use that insulin as the first way of helping those with diabetes be able to beat or be able to manage the condition. And it wasn't until January of 1922 that the first human patient was injected with insulin that successfully helped him with that. So agriculture, medicine, and everything in between combining here today as we talk about history. But we're not here to talk about that side of agriculture. We're here to talk about the field, the forage, and all of the good stuff that comes first. So with that, and without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. And we are joined by Jerry Clark, who is a regional crops and soils educator with the Division of Extension at UW-Madison, as well as Dr. Luiz Ferraretto, who is an assistant professor and ruminant nutrition extension specialist with UW-Madison. So thank you both for being here this afternoon. I know this is a very pertinent topic. It is one that's on the top of many producers' minds. So very important that we make sure we get through this information for them. But also, if you're a producer watching live, make sure to ask your questions. That is what these experts are here for. So ask your questions, get them answered, especially as we really begin to think forward about what this year's forage and crops looks like after it comes out of the field. So with all that being said, Jerry, would you mind giving us a brief introduction about yourself here before we start things off?
Sure. Thank you, Amber, for the opportunity today. Yes, I'm Jerry Clark. I'm the regional crops and soils educator for Dunn, Chippewa, and Eau Claire counties up in northwestern Wisconsin. And I've been with the Extension Service about 25 years now, just started my 26th year.
Well, thank you for being here today. And Dr. Luiz, I know we've had you on a few other times. Would you mind giving us a brief introduction about yourself here before we kick things off as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, Amber. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure being able to join the Dairy Signals. I'm Luiz Ferraretto. I'm an assistant professor, and I'm actually a dairy nutritionist with the Animal and Dairy Science Department, as well as the Division of Extension at UW-Madison. And I work with research and extension focus on forage quality and digestibility, manipulation of diets to better understand carbohydrate utilization by dairy cows, as well as evaluating and refining assays for forage and feed analysis. And looking forward to our discussion today.
Well, thank you both for being here. I also do have to say a huge thank you as we begin today to our sponsor for the month of July, which is Prairie Estates Genetics, and they help make programs like this episode possible. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Prairie Estates Genetics is a great resource for all of your feed and forage needs. And everybody knows that the better your investment, the better your payoff. And at Prairie Estates Genetics, they know that what you invest in silage directly affects the quantity and quality of milk production. So if you're looking for a better investment, stop stomaching the old generation of seed you're currently using and look towards next gen seed that yields next gen results. So you can check them out at nextgeniofc.com. But for now, let's dive into today's discussion, and I'm going to actually turn it over to Jerry to get started here.
All right, thank you, Amber. Going to just kind of give a little brief overview of kind of the weather situation and how we got to where we are today, and a few things that we can look for down the road over the next couple of months as we kind of charge towards that corn silage harvest. So we've all known kind of the last few months, especially 6 weeks, about this dry weather that's been going on. But if we just look back to May 2nd, we kind of called it the weather whiplash. So we went from, almost a soggy, saturated condition as of May 2nd. There was no drought situation across the state in terms of the U.S. Drought Monitor. But then by the end of May, just a month later, 30 days later, basically, we started to see that abnormally dry weather starting to creep in across most of the state. And so we all know kind of how these things can change with the drought monitor, but this is about as good as we can get. We all know there's a lot of farmers will say that map's not accurate. We've argued we got rain, my neighbor didn't. And I think we've been hearing that story pretty much across the state with such scattered rainfall. Maybe that rain we got the other day was maybe the most we got that was more statewide. So, what happened this spring, I think, was this big high pressure system in Canada. We know we had very dry weather, very low humidity, which was kind of crazy going into June, even that we had humidities that were in the 30s and the 20s. But this big high pressure system just would not move out of the way. And that's what kept that nice, clear, dry weather coming, I guess, from that standpoint. So we caught up in our planting season and these kind of things relatively quickly coming out of that wet spring. But then when things really started turning dry, that's when we started to see some issues with crop emergence, especially with corn and soybeans. But since we're talking mainly forages today, we'll stick to the corn silage side of things. But we saw that throughout this growing season that there was this emergence problem, planting into dry conditions and just hoping it was going to rain that would get our crop out of the ground. And so where are we at today over the last month or so since July 4th? And again, these monitors come out. The weather's probably recorded a week ahead before the monitor actually publishes. But this was the first we started to see red on the map was July 4th down in, again, that Madison area, southern Wisconsin. But across the state, somewhere it was abnormally dry or starting to get into that D1 category. And then as of last week, and I think this is registered as of July 20th, but they registered on the 18th, starting to see a little bit more red in the map on the north and south ends. But again, it's really not alleviating as much. We are catching some rainfall, and that's where this season is so hard to predict as far as what's the crop look like, simply because we have this scattering effect of the rainfall. And like I said earlier, it's easy to see a mile away where you got a nice rain, the neighbor didn't. So it's just been so scattered this year that we're starting to see that effect on the production side of things. So if we expand it a little bit further, this is where I think we start to see the issue with across the nation then in these major cattle and forage areas, especially across that Nebraska, South Dakota area where we typically get a lot of our hay from. Even down into those grazing areas into Missouri and Iowa. So these are areas that cross that belt of the Midwest where we see a lot of cattle, major forage producing areas. That's where we're starting to see the impact on forage stocks. So hay stocks, these kind of things. And so we start to see the price of feed going up. And that's always an issue in a drought because there's going to be a decision that needs to be made. Are we going to get rid of cattle? Are we going to buy feed? Of course, the milk price isn't helping. So we've got a major, all these trains are coming together, and we're hoping it's not a total disaster, but it's not looking good from that standpoint. And I'm not an economist, but I know when you pay a lot for feed, costs a lot to grow it, but your product coming out the other end isn't worth as much. There is an economic issue there. So again, across the Midwest, we're seeing that issue as well, being a problem with forage stocks. So this is a graph, and I give credit to Dr. Joe Lauer, our corn specialist at UW-Madison. He puts these maps together, these little charts every few weeks. And basically, this is the precipitation at 2 of our research stations. But for the most part, looking at Arlington and Marshfield, we started dry and then, or started overly wet, above average precipitation. We've kind of crossed into that area where now, especially in southern Wisconsin, down by the Arlington Research Station, we've been at least 4 inches below precipitation. So we're seeing that drop below that trend line. We're starting to tick back up a little bit over these last couple of weeks, catching some rains in southern Wisconsin. But up towards the north where I'm located, we've been getting those scattered rainfalls, again, 1/2 inch here, 6/10 there. They come every once in a while, but you start adding that up, it's keeping things going. It's not a bumper crop by any means, but at least we're seeing the trend line hitting kind of on the average. And so we're seeing certain areas of the state starting to get a little bit more moisture. So what's interesting is when you look at a crop progress report is the crop conditions as of June 18th. What's interesting, kind of in the dead heat of this, drought that we were starting to run into, we were still having, 70% of our crop, 80% of our corn crop being reported as good, fair to good. There's not a lot of excellent corn out there. We wouldn't expect that, but it kind of surprises me that we're seeing that much being reported. And it really hasn't changed that much as of July 23rd was our latest report, still hitting around that 70-75% in the fair to good range. So that kind of gives us a little bit of hope that maybe the corn crop's not as bad as we think it is. Maybe we'll have good pollination, and we'll talk about that in a second here. But it's interesting that we're starting to see that the weather is starting to go in our favor. And if we are going to have dry weather, let's have it at the front end of things, and maybe we can at least salvage that crop coming out the back end. So then if we look at the crop progress from a silking standpoint, we can see we're starting to get into it. Last year, we were about 30% silk. Right now, we're 25% silked across the state. I think that's bumping up a little bit now that we're starting to see this next week. I think that'll take a little bit higher jump across the state. But then even alfalfa, we're starting to get into that third cutting. So farmers are starting to see those numbers starting to come up a little bit as far as getting that third cutting off. And then that corn silking is a little bit lower than our history in the past, but due to the delayed planting and now having that emergence all over the board, that's another one that we need to deal with. So what's the weather impact on this corn silage? What is that really going to mean? What we saw was, cover crop made an effect this year early. So this is a little, we've seen this at our plots here in Chippewa County, where we've done some cover crop trials, and where those cover crops are, they're competing for moisture. And so we've seen where there wasn't cover crops, maybe that crop is a little bit taller. We don't know if there's going to be an effect on yield yet. We'll find that out this fall. But I think there was that cover crop interaction with moisture this year. They're going to compete with that corn just as much as any weed or anything else that needs to be out there. Herbicide performance, we heard about a lot of that. So there's maybe a few extra weeds out there simply because we didn't get those pre-emergent herbicides activated. And so herbicide performance is an issue. This variable emergence and reduced height, I think that's where the issue is going to be. You've got maybe 5 different stages of corn growth in the same field, depending if there's a low spot, a knoll, a gravelly knoll, whatever it is. You're seeing that variance across. It's hard to find a uniform field in Wisconsin right now because it seems to be all over the board. And then that reduced height, and what does that mean in terms of the amount of yield? Obviously, that's going to affect corn silage. But then, how about that grain to stover ratio? So production issues. We've seen nitrogen deficiency out there quite often, simply because these nutrients need to be soluble in water. You can have all the nitrogen you want out there. If it's not in some kind of moisture water form to be taken up, it's basically going to sit there or volatilize. So hopefully we don't have an issue as we're starting to get more rain with leaching in some of these sandier soils. But we did see some definite nitrogen deficiency out there in a lot of these cornfields. So like I said before, what do these reduced yields mean on a corn silage side of things? Well, the end result could be a high energy corn silage. Sometimes you call it a super corn silage, but you've got typically in a normal year, it's about 50-50. The biomass or the mass of that plant is going to be about 40 to 45% grain, 50 to 55 to 60% dry matter. We could see this flipped a little bit, especially since we had drought stressed corn that stayed short. It moved through those vegetative stages. And if it got rain where it didn't die or is really stressed, it starts to grow, it's going to stay short. But then if we get pollination at normal and somewhat normal pollination, we could have this normal ear on a very short corn stalk. So now we've got this, maybe this corn silage, this high energy corn silage that we weren't planning on, but that's something that could be a definite reality in a number of fields across Wisconsin. So then what else could cause some issues with the stressed corn? We always look at maybe there's, okay, what do I need for how much yield is out there? Well, we can estimate about a ton per acre per foot of corn height. You take the tassel off and it's going to be about a ton per acre out there of that material. You can also have nitrate accumulation out there. So again, if it's really dry and we get that rainfall immediately afterwards, you'll see those nitrate concentrations, especially lower in the stalk, go up. Usually want to wait about 10 days if we're in an issue where we needed to do some emergency harvesting or anything like that. And then mycotoxins, sometimes you'll see those present a little bit more in stress plants. They can also show up in healthy plants, but I think there could be a little bit leaning more towards the mycotoxin side that could possibly be present in those stress plants. And then we could have stalk rots. Usually that plant's not healthy, and so there's some pathogens can get in there depending on hybrid selection, the location of the field, soil type. Some of these kind of things can be driven by that anthracnose that could cause some lodging, weaker plants out there. And then, of course, that's going to just relate to more harvest issues. So not only do we have a variance in maturity out there, but now we may have some issues with some of these other problems. And then, of course, this time of year, we're looking at pollination time, right? This is going to set the stage for grain fill. Like I said, 25% of the states in that from the report last week. I think we're definitely going to be higher than that when this next report comes out. But looking at most fields across Wisconsin, we're starting to enter this stage. Late planted corn is still vegetative. Those might be the fields that maybe have the best chance of having somewhat of a more normal looking field where you have the normal height of a plant with a normal corn yield on it. But pollination is going to set that stage for grain fill. And as we move through pollination, that's when the water demand is going to come up. So when we look at predicting the harvest time, that's what silking and that pollination time we kind of rely on. So vegetatively, that corn can grow at just, it takes as many days as that hybrid is selected, bred for. So it's going to take that many days to grow vegetatively. But then once it silks and hits that reproductive stage, that's the same pretty much across any variety or hybrid. So regardless of what your day maturity is, that reproductive stage is going to be 55 to 60 days. So we can kind of figure 42 to 47 days, somewhere in there, is about that half milk line where we can start to trigger that corn silage harvest. So from that silking to black layer stage, figure about 55 to 60 days maturity, but for corn silage harvest, somewhere in that 42 to 47 days after silking, we can kind of start to get a ballpark of when we may need to pull the trigger on that. So the question is, are my plants pollinated, right? How do we tell if they got pollinated? I took this picture in one of our research plots here yesterday. So again, we've got, you can peel these husks back, and if the silks fall off, they've been pollinated. And so in this, I was kind of happy to see in the little field that I manage that most of those silks fell off right on the end. There's a little bit of probably not going to get much grain fill. So that can give me an indication what my yield may be going forward. Adequate rainfall, the nutrients are there, no other weather issues. We could maybe see that most of this cob is going to fill out, but we're probably going to have some bare tips on the end here. So again, just an easy way to tell if your field is pollinated. Peel these husks back very gently, hold it kind of sideways, and if the silks just drop right off, you know it got pollinated. So from here on out, we can hopefully, make it to the finish line.
So I was just going to say, let me ask a question that came in by one of our listeners already, and it's in this area, and it reads, looking ahead with pollination and silking, if it stays dry or limited rain, what can we expect at silage harvest? And I mean, yours looks at least pretty decent in terms of, corn cob ears, at least for pollination right here. I mean, like you said, you might have a little on the top that isn't pollinated all the way through, but as you mentioned, there's so much variability out there. And some people have been fortunate enough to get those little spurts here and there of rain, but what if you haven't? Are you kind of SOL at this point?
Yeah, that pollination period's like 10 days. So you've got that narrow window for it to get pollinated. I think if you find out that 50% of that field is not pollinated or it didn't pollinate at all, that's where you have to start to look at from a corn silage standpoint. There is a peak of quality right now at pollination. And so that's the time to probably, if this didn't get pollinated, that might be the time to take it. Unfortunately, it's sooner than later. Again, looking at, if this had half of the silk still hanging on it, can we figure half a grain yield out there? And then we can decide, how do we manage this crop for, is it for a dry cow feed? Is it going to be for heifers? What are we going to have to supplement it with for the energy side of it? So I don't think there's a real good answer other than corn does have a peak quality right about now at silking. And then it goes down for a little bit until that grain starts to fill. And then we see the quality of corn silage go back up. So it's not like alfalfa where it gets worse as it sits in the field. Corn actually has two peaks, one now at silking, and then another one as that grain fill starts to rise. And I think I've got a slide here in a little bit that kind of shows that graph. But what do you do if it didn't get pollinated? I think that's, kind of at the end of the program today is that feed inventory, and then what can it be used for? But if you're looking for high quality, I think right now there is a peak with corn silage. If it didn't get pollinated, now would be the time to look at it.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that's just something to think about as you're walking fields and as producers are out there looking at what they have, that, you're not stuck where you're at. There's options, but it might not always be the best option. So it's always good to know what they are, though. So thank you, and I'll let you continue on.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll continue to scout those fields. I think that's where we're not to the finish line yet. So there's insect pressure out there yet. We got corn rootworm beetles, we got leafhoppers and alfalfa. Cover that in a minute. Some of these spider mites and aphids, they like drier weather. So anytime we have a different change or some abnormal weather, there's always another pest that's opportunistic, and we'll move in for that. So keep eyes on that. Some late emerging annuals that might be out there, some water hemp, giant ragweed, velvet leaf, those bigger seeded weeds that germinate over a long period of time. So they were laying there waiting for water, just like the corn was. And so as we, if that herbicide did not get activated, we could see some of these, and then we get rainfall later on, like now, we could see some of these annuals starting to pop up. That might be a problem, maybe not this year, but next year, or they're at least competing for some of those water and nutrients that are still there. I did take this picture yesterday, and we've got Japanese beetle issues in a few areas. And you may say, well, they're not a big deal, but they do clip silks. And so I was looking at this yesterday that the silks I have are starting to be clipped, but most of it's pollinated. So I'm hoping that that's not an issue in the little field that I manage. But keep an eye out, continue scouting. That's always going to be an issue with pests. So this was kind of like the question we just received was, what if it's unpollinated and, harvesting now, which might not be the best option. But you'll see that corn silage corn for silage and yield and quality, it's going to change. So there is this little peak in milk per acre, right around in milk per ton, right around that R1 stage, which we're at for silking. So again, that R1 stage, we start to see a little bit of peak in milk per acre, and starting to drop in milk per ton. But we're seeing more mass out there. Quality's not too bad. But then we see this drop. Once we start to get into that initial grain filling stage, starting to get into that dough and blister stage, and then corn silage starts to ramp up in quality again because we're getting more starch, more energy in it. So the question about if it's unpollinated, what do I do? This might be that peak area right in here where we're starting to see, that R2 stage is kind of that first peak of forage or corn silage quality, and then we move forward as we get grain fill going. So that's kind of the spiel on corn silage. Alfalfa, Again, heard a lot of reports. Second crop was much better than first. Third looks to be a little bit better than second. So maybe we're starting to turn the corner on the hay stocks in some areas. But again, it's so sporadic. We really don't know what each individual farmer is kind of wrestling with their own inventory for alfalfa or any of the forages other than corn silage right now. But again, fair to good yields or fair to good report for most of the state. We're talking close to 80% are in that fair to good range. No excellence, but at least we're not stuck all down here in the poor to very poor range for what's being reported. So alfalfa conditions, I think, overall are okay. Definitely not a bumper crop, but we may have to look at what the ration looks like going forward from that standpoint. So alfalfa, second, third cutting, we're pretty much wrapped up with second, moving well into third. So I think that's where we're going to need that extra water that's coming forward, moving forward for that third and fourth crop. And alfalfa is one of our biggest demanders for water. So it takes about 844 pounds of water basically to produce a pound of dry matter. So it takes a lot of water. If we're looking at 8 gallons or 8 to 10 pounds, 8 pounds of water, we're talking about 100 gallons of water just to produce that 1 pound of dry matter. So a lot of water for alfalfa compared to corn, which seems to be, is much more efficient. So part of why alfalfa kind of hangs in there is it's got this very deep root zone. It can hang on. It goes dormant, doesn't grow great. Sometimes we have to clip it if we don't want to, but we have to clip that to maybe capture what we can get out there, but it helps stimulate some of those buds, get it growing again when water does come. But alfalfa's got this extensive root zone that can go down, upwards of 16 feet to 20 feet deep versus some of our corn and soybean plants, which maybe hang around that 5-foot range. So again, alfalfa is one that can really pull in a lot of water. So getting close to the end here on this part of it, but the feed inventory side is the next step. All right, we've got, what do we have out there we can start to maybe predict what we might have for a corn silage yield just based on silking. As we know, it's not going to get any taller. So we've hit the height and now it's a grain filling issue. So what do we have out there for current feedstocks? Start doing an inventory on what you've got on hand, and then maybe looking forward is starting to predict into the crystal ball. What's first and second crop cutting look like? How's third going? Are we going to get a fourth? Is it worth a fourth? These kind of things. And I think that's going to be the next condition is, are we taking that late fall cutting? And then is there going to be an issue in October harvest? And then do we just hope it snows and covers everything so we don't have a freeze out issue looking well down into the crystal ball at this point? But knowing what you have right now and kind of projecting where you're going to be in the next couple of months is going to help with that feed inventory. Current animal size and numbers, how big are they? How many cattle are you going to hang on to? These kind of things. And I think that's the wrestling part right now is what kind of, are we going to make some culling decisions? Those inefficient cows, are they going to go? Are we going to keep as many heifers, calves, whatever we're doing? And then what's the future? How many do you need? How are we going to keep those fed? Those kind of things. So taking a stock of what you have now, and then you can start to look at how long is my current feed going to last? Is it going to be enough to get me to a certain point and looking forward? Do you need to buy feed? And then do animals need to be sold? So those are the questions that we're going to have to answer definitely in a month or two. Extension does have a feed inventory tool. It's on the livestock page of our extension page. And this calculator is pretty nice because it's got all different types of storage structure calculators. You can look at a feed forage need calculator. So you can put in how many head of cattle you got, how big they are, how much they're going to need, what you plan to feed them. And it kind of cranks out, you can use it as a kind of a record keeping system, but it also looks forward as far as what you're going to need. So I'd encourage you to look at that spreadsheet, and it's pretty self-explanatory and easy to use. The group that worked on it did an excellent job with that. Getting towards the end here, but some alternative emergency forages if you need to get into that season. These are the ones that I just looked at, some UW research that we've got planted after August 1st. So we're already past up to July 1st. Corn still makes your most sense. That's going to be your most tons per acre, planting up to July 1st. You get into August 1st, corn's still okay, but some of these others produce a little bit more tons dry matter per acre. So that's where you start to look at the sorghum, Sudan grass hybrids. Some of these small grains actually don't do too bad. The barley, oats, those kind of things that you can plant, kind of cool season, get some harvest this fall yet. Turnips actually provide a pretty good protein source. Again, seed could be expensive. So there again, you got to weigh some of those kind of things. And then what's interesting is maybe a mix of winter wheat. So you grow some oats or grow some winter wheat, and looking again towards spring forage needs. So jumping ahead to next spring, plant some winter wheat now, interseed some oats with it in the spring, and you can kind of get this flush that you can harvest hopefully like early June or something like that, that you can get a little extra protein or feed for. So those are the kind of things that we're kind of limited as we get later and later in the growing season, but there's still some options out there if you need some emergency forage. So I'll just wrap up with this, Amber, that we'll be entering the high water demand season. So we're going to need more. We're kind of limping along here, and there's areas that never have got out of that drought stress, but in areas, things don't look too bad. Again, with that fair to good rating in corn and alfalfa, we're looking forward a little bit on that. We need more water, that's for sure, as we enter this high demand season. Again, we're going to be using about 1/3 of an inch a day. Monitor for corn pollination. That's going to be your biggest determination of how things are set up going forward. We're going to still need more rain, obviously. Check on that feed inventory, and then if it's needed, start to look at those alternative forage type demand things that you're going to need. But that'll all be determined by how many cattle you're going to keep and what you already have in stock. So if anyone's got any question, there's some contact information. Otherwise, you can track Amber or myself down.
Well, Jerry, thank you for that. I do another question. As we are looking ahead and thinking about, that 45 days for corn silage once it's tasseling and pollinating and all that good stuff is happening, but we have this variability in the fields. What are your tips for harvest this year? Because as you mentioned, it is just all over the place depending on which way you look. So yeah. What's going to be helpful to producers to be thinking about as they head that way here at the end of the month?
Yeah, I think shoot for the average. If that variability is all over the board, looking at those more mature plants, looking at some of those that are definitely going to be behind in that field, picking and choosing and chopping out a section and then coming back a week or two later and chopping out another section. If that's an option, then you could capture that. But the storage part becomes a nightmare, silage bags or, separating feed out. If that's an option, great. But I think the way we handle corn silage now is once we roll into a field, we want to take it off. We're not going to pick and choose where we go. So I think from that standpoint, we're going to have to shoot for the middle. And I think that's where Luiz can help. If you've got a little bit wetter corn silage, a little bit drier corn silage, maybe, if energy is needed, letting it get a little more mature might not be a bad idea. And then making sure you have kernel processors, those kind of things in the machines that can make that digestibility as high as possible. So capturing as much dry matter out there as possible can be an option. It's just we have to manage that a little bit differently during harvest, so we make sure we're not really sacrificing a lot on quality, because that without the grain on that stalk, we basically have got a grassy forage, and so the grain is what drives the value. And so from that standpoint, we need to make sure we've got good quality going in, and then if we can, if it's across the board, I think you shoot for the middle. Maybe a little on the mature side, possibly, but it all depends on what your needs are. And then if you can separate feeds out a little bit, if one part of the field is way ahead of the other, we may have to treat them separately. But when we're harvesting corn silage, it's usually let's go and get it off, and hopefully it's we're at least hitting the middle of what we're shooting for. But it's going to be a challenge this year. It's all with so much variability in the field. I think the whole plant the dry down days, that extension or local co-ops do, I think all of that's going to be a pretty important thing to look at is getting an idea of what that whole plant moisture is across those fields.
Yeah, this is one of those years that knowing what your fields look like, knowing what's in your field is going to have a huge impact not only on the quality, as you were mentioning, but as we'll dive into here with Luiz here in a few minutes, the feed inventory as well. So thank you, Jerry, for your information. We're going to jump over to Luiz here now, but I do want to remind people, if you have any more questions at all along this line, feel free to keep typing them in. We'll ask Jerry those here at the end. But for now, we're going to switch over and have a little bit of a discussion with Dr. Luiz Ferraretto as we talk about inventory, quality, and all of that stuff that's going to be impacted once we get that feed off the field. So, Dr. Luiz, we've got, let's pick up where we just kind of left off here with Jerry. Let's talk about, well, what does it look like when we're coming off of the field with this variable corn silage? What does that look like quality wise? What should we really be talking with our nutritionist about in order to be best prepared for it when it comes on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for a boring nutritionist like me, I think is a concerning scenario, right? And boring because I like routine, right? I like my diets to be very similar all the time. I hope the cows like that too. And consequently, when we have a lot of variability, it creates concerns in having to change the diets more often and so on, right? Also in changing the ingredients and potential structure for storage and etc. But I think it's a great point because when you have extremely variable fields, it's what Jerry mentioned, right? Selecting parts of the field to harvest, it becomes probably not viable. Maybe for some it could be done, but in general, it's not really what we will see. What I'm wondering is if a potential strategy is if you have a good idea on what parts of those fields are wetter or drier, or which fields are wetter or drier, maybe adjusting some of the harvester settings may be helpful, right? If you decide to leave silage for a little bit longer in the field in order to don't have too wet of a material in certain parts, perhaps when you reach that dry area, would be very wise to make the row gap settings tighter, also to maybe reduce to a certain extent the shock length and make sure you actually harvest that corn silage quite well, right? Because if we wait too long, kernels get harder. They are much harder to break. If we don't break, starch is like if it's not there, right? Because it ends up in the manure. So it's something that we could consider. Other issues associated with something that's drier, especially for corn plants, would be the particles, they become coarser. And coarser particles, they are harder to pack, take longer actually to pack, or you end up with more air entrapped in your silo, which delays fermentation and could create more problems later on for aerobic stability or the shelf life of the silage, if you will. So those are some of the things that could be considered, right? Obviously, in years like these, it requires way more monitoring of your crop than usual, right? Not that you don't have to do that every year very carefully for every field. It just requires more so you have a better grasp of what's going on with your field. So.
Well, okay. And let's talk another part about what Jerry was mentioning. You know, if you have the opportunity to be able to go into your fields and chop some at one time and maybe go back a few days to a week later and chop some again. How does that, I don't want to say mess up if you're using bags or any of that good stuff, but how is that going to impact that feed going on, not only, you know, when you open up those bags or those bunkers or whatever it is for use for forage, but what are some of the things to consider or think about if that's a route you're looking at taking?
So if you have bags, it's slightly, I'm going to say easier. It's not necessarily easier, right? You can implement that because with the bags, at least you can separate a little bit more the feeds, right? However, there is a misconcept that the variation of the corn silage or other forages throughout a bag is not as much as it would be for a bunker. But actually it is, right? Because the bunker, in theory, you put multiple layers, so it kind of counterbalance the average of the material, right? In the bags, you may see variation as you go through. So we have to be careful regardless. If this is a possibility, you can target a little bit better for what we would call maybe ideal or closer to the ideal type of moisture, as well as processing and everything else for harvesting. So you can kind of handpick some of the bags for different animal categories or different groups within lactation and so on. But it also creates a lot of more issues in terms of logistics, and you have to be way more organized to that and so on, right? If you cannot do that, then you put all those variable materials in a bunker or in a bag, regardless of what you use, you should expect more variation. So probably would be wise to actually analyze some of those samples more often, right? Nowadays that commercial laboratories can analyze feeds by NIR so fast, I think it's quite helpful to get some of those results more and more often so you can keep track of that, right? And keep track is the correct word. I'm not saying that you have to analyze, see a result, get desperate, and change your diet, right? At the end of the day, you don't change the diet because you saw one sample that looks bad. You have to actually pay attention to the last couple of samples. So having more may be beneficial, right? So that's how I see a potential adjustment to some of those scenarios.
Okay, thank you. I want to take a step back now and let's just talk about what are our expectations for feed this year? Where should we be setting them? We know we're not going to have the best feed on record here, more than likely, but where should we be setting those expectations as we look towards this crop coming in?
I think it depends on how the weather treats us now, right? Based on Jerry's presentation, there are a lot of scenarios that we can go through. If we end up with silage that has a small amount of kernels or corn grain, you should expect very low starch, obviously, right? And this is important because the material will be wetter, right? Because the true dry matter in the corn plants are the grain, right? The plants have some, but the majority will be the kernels. And under those conditions, you should expect lower energy value for those. So nutritionists and dairy farmers will have to come up with replacements, right? Either buy corn grain that is coming from other areas that didn't have so many issues as here, perhaps with droughts, although it looks like the entire US have variable scenarios this year. Or using other byproducts that have rapidly degradable carbohydrates. There are multiple byproducts that could be used, soy hulls, for example, or feeds that are reaching sugar, like whey permeates, could be a good example of that as well. So farmers will have to look for those. If we have the other scenario that Jerry mentioned as the super corn silage, which is also a concern because at the end of the day, if you have an abnormal value of starch, it creates a challenge on the rumen of the dairy cow. At the end of the day, starch is great, right? It provides a lot of energy. It helps with milk production, but excessive starch and lack of forage fiber leads to issues for ruminal acidosis or potential ruminal acidosis, and consequently drops in butterfat, right? And we don't want that to happen. So if that's the case, we have to figure out ways of balancing the diet to remove other sources of starch, if there are other sources, and those would be high moisture corn or early corn grain, and probably try to add other forages, right? Alfalfa could be an option. Different types of hays, silage, etc., will become quite important under those conditions, so we can properly balance that for the cows. Exactly what's going to happen is quite hard to predict. I actually watched it last week, Dr. John Gazer presenting some of his predictions, and I don't say that very often, but I honestly hope John is wrong. Okay, because he mentioned that there's a chance you're going to have more digestible fiber this year. And if you heard me speaking about silage fiber digestibility, I love digestible fiber. But this year, if we have issues with inventories and more digestible fiber, it means that cows are eating more and we have less, so we will have some issues, right? So from that perspective, I hope John is wrong. I don't think he's necessarily wrong on that because there's a high chance this is the case, right? Let's wait for some analysis to see that. But if that's the case, then there are some considerations that have to be made, right? Perhaps adding some slightly less digestible forages could be an option, right? To perhaps try to hold some of the material in the rumen of the dairy cow, reduce a little bit passage rate, and then hopefully be able to copy with the forage inventories.
Well, I have to say, you read my mind. I was going to ask about digestibility next, especially because of last week's comment. But you beat me right to it with that one. But as we're looking ahead, okay, and say we are low on forage, and we know we're going to be low, and that is something that is going to be of concern, especially as if digestibility is high, we're going to be going through it faster than the next year here. What do we do? What are our options, especially as we are, well, nearing August 1st? I know Jerry said a couple of different options of what could be planned here starting in August, or what to maybe look forward to. But what do we do? Because that is always the catch-22 of it all.
Yeah, we'll have to look for other options, right? Other feed options, if you will. So basically, Jerry gave some of the examples of other crops that perhaps farmers could try to buy or plant now to see if get some extra yield, right? Either now, the fall or winter, or next spring in the case of high grass, for example. So these could be options in order to stretch a little bit your forage inventory. Other options would be to add more byproducts to the diet, at the expense of forages. If that's the way to go, there are some considerations as well, right? If we replace forages with non-forage fiber sources, like soy hulls, again, as an example, we have to be careful, because even though both are fiber, they are not the same type of fiber, right? Coincidentally, we ran a study last year replacing corn silage with soy hulls to test exactly that. We kept the starch values the same, so it's not exactly the same replacement that would happen, right, 1-to-1 in the field. But we try to understand that. And the issue of putting more byproducts and not forages is that the cows will be eating a little bit more as well, right? Because it's easier for cows to eat the more digestible feed. It's faster to masticate. It doesn't require reducing too much the size, so they are able to swallow that feed and so on. So it increases passage rate. And under those conditions, you may see a small drop in butter fat as well, and even feed efficiency, right? So you have to be careful with those. Perhaps reduce starch to a greater extent. To what we did in our study, we kept exactly the same. So definitely not what I would advise people to do in the field. Right. So those are some of the considerations. And let's be honest, if that's the way to go, because we don't have other ways of getting more forages, that's what we have to do. So we have to just be more careful, pay closer attention to the nutritional management, right? Diets that cows can eat faster and creates a more susceptible environment for milk fat drop. We have to pay very close attention, make sure cows are not competing too much at the feed bunk, that you have a pretty good routine. So you're feeding the same time every day, good amount of push-ups, etc., to avoid any potential issues associated with that as well.
Okay. We did have a question come in, and it's, I would think, slightly along this lines here, and it reads, depending on the weather, some are predicting issues for grain corn growers with yield. I've been told it may be an option for farmers to consider a flow on inventory this year in need of feed. What are your thoughts?
For those that can produce corn grain, I think it would work, right? Or if you can buy fields that were initially planned for corn grain and harvest as silage, I think it would be a good idea if you predict some issues with forage inventories. What I don't know is how expensive those fields will be, right? Because all the time we have forage inventory issues, prices will go up, right? And so I guess the real question is, can you buy it at a reasonable price compared to the other options that are out there? And I have no idea about that. My economy classes were quite limited, so I have to be careful on suggesting anything like that, I guess.
Well, that's fair enough. I mean, it's a good answer and what you can understand or what you can explain with what you know. One question that I do have actually relates once again back to what Jerry was talking about earlier. You know, if you have low pollination and you know that and you're walking your fields and you decide that you need to harvest now during that peak and that's your best option, as a nutritionist, what does that look like? Is that something you recommend? How would that look for not only inventory in this next year, but also just in, you know, the terms of getting it off and what to consider?
I think it's important that we pay close attention to moisture, right? If without pollination, moisture is too high, I think we have to be careful with predictions related to the milk per acre, milk per ton, because those are made in a forage basis, right? So without considering the fermentation aspect of that, okay? That's just how the tool is designed, okay? Please don't get me wrong. I think it's a great tool, right? But from a fermentation perspective, if you are moving a lot of water to the silo because those plants are too wet, you may end up with a lot of losses in terms of effluents, and the fermentation may not be great, right? This creates other challenges because if fermentation is not great, you have to look out for potentially other issues caused by that, right? Aerobic stability will be worse. Proliferation of yeast and molds that feed out will probably be higher. You're going to lose a lot of nutrients together with the effluent. So you have to be very careful if you decide to do that. Regardless, it's probably worth, unless you have a different plan of planting something immediately that may help you with, perhaps you should keep there and let the plants at least mature a little bit so you don't have too much struggles with moisture range to make sure that silage ferments well. And just as a rule of thumb, I would always be very careful harvesting anything below 30%, right? Or you can harvest that, but don't put in the silo below 30% dry matter because the fermentation is way more challenging because of that.
Okay, good things to know and consider if that's what you're looking at for your options. You know, as we're talking about all of this and we're thinking about feed inventory and we're thinking about next year and, you know, just even in the future, if we encounter times like this where we are like, well, shoot, it's a struggle. We don't know if we're going to be able to make it to the next year with where we're at with what we've got. How do we manage that so that this becomes less of a factor in years to come or becomes less of something that we have to worry about? If there is any strategies that you could impart on us.
Of course. I think one of the most important things to discuss, even when we have issues with forage inventories, or when we have issues with high feed prices or both, is the importance of making sure we actually have very good storage practices. And consequently, we would have decreased losses, right? And I think that should be considered a metric of feed efficiency. The reason for that is taking both ways here, forage inventory as well as feed prices. If you harvest 1,000 tons, but you only use 800, it costs exactly the same amount, right? So your feed price go up, your diets are more expensive, your income over feed costs are very likely lower, right? At the same time, if you harvest 1,000 tons, but you only feed 800, you should consider that you actually only have 800 tons per whatever unit you're using here. Right. And I think that's quite important because that really decreases your inventory. So avoiding losses, regardless of what type of losses those are, it's quite important, right? And usually losses are primarily, in the case of corn silage, would be primarily related to poor silage management, either packing, sealing, or at feed out, right? This is also true for other in-silo crops. So it would be something very important to keep fine-tuning. I think there are a lot of dairies that do a great job with that, but we can keep fine-tuning to make sure if we reduce 1%, great. 1% of 1,000 tons is 10 tons. You know, it's a still valuable feed there, and it's an important metric in terms of feed prices, right? But this is also true for concentrate feeds, right? And I think for concentrate feed, sometimes probably there is a little bit less control than with forage inventories, but we still have to do that because you still pay full price regardless of what you buy. So it's another way of making sure you actually stretch your inventory and you keep your feed prices a little bit lower, right? Because high feed prices and loss, it's higher feed prices, right?
Well, and I think that's a great tip, and just even anything to be thinking about as we go forward, whether that be when we're packing or at corn silage stage all the way through. And I think that's something that, as you mentioned, always can be improved on. So that is a great tip for everybody just to be thinking about. With all that being said, Dr. Luiz, we are getting towards the end of the hour. Is there anything else you want to contribute on this side when we're talking about feed management, inventory, quality, all of that before we wrap up here this afternoon?
No, I think we cover all the key aspects of that. The only other thing I will mention is if you decide to use different types of byproducts, especially wet byproducts, also analyze those more often. Okay, wet byproducts are quite variable. They are great feeds. They provide good amount of energy and protein most part of the time, but they have more variability than dry byproducts. But dry byproducts vary as well, right? So analyzing those, especially when you add greater quantities to diets, become even more important.
Okay, thank you. As we wrap up here today, we wouldn't end with a dairy signal without asking the best question that there is what can producers really be thinking about or actively doing from today's discussion? So I'm going to ask you that, Jerry. What from your portion do you really think producers need to be thinking about doing, or even just getting right into after today?
Well, number one, I think is as you get into that silking stage, see if things were pollinated. That'll start to drive a lot of decisions about what to do with the crop, like Luiz said, or as we move forward. And then I think that feed inventory, you're going to need to do that, whether you pencil that out, use a spreadsheet, but at least get an idea of how many head you got and pull that inventory together so you've got an idea moving into this fall.
Okay, thank you. And what about you, Dr. Luiz? What are those last minute things or those last comments that you want to impart on all of us here before leaving about what to do and what to be thinking about from today's conversation?
Yeah, I will reinforce Jerry's comments. It's key to make sure you know exactly what you have, so you know exactly how to feed your cows and the other animal categories you have, but also pay close attention to the quality, because this year we will see probably more variation than we would like, and this may affect performance. So I guess those would be the key take homes for today.
Well, I think that is a fantastic way to end, great messages to end on, especially as we're looking forward to, hopefully it will be a less chaotic year than we're already predicting at corn silage time, but time will tell, especially with the weather here. But thank you both for being here today and having some really great information that's so tactical and so important for right now where we're at in the growing season. So thank you for your time here. I also want to say thank you once again to Prairie Estates Genetics for sponsoring today's episode, including the entire month of July. To make sure to learn more about them and the offers that they have available to you by heading over to nextgeniofc.com. But for now, I want to say thank you for joining us here this week on the Dairy Signal. Thanks for joining us today and asking your questions. But for now, have a great rest of your day, a great weekend, and we'll see you here next week on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.